Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon when you're watching this flipped video. This is for chapter 5.3. And this whole video is going to be about growth of urbanization. We'll specifically, for this first video, be looking at 3 different cities in the state of Washington. Let's begin, shall we? Before we can talk about the urbanization of cities in our state, we first need to talk about what urbanization actually is. Urbanization is the changing of small communities into big communities, going from rural farming to urban city. In the state of Washington, you saw that within one generation, which is roughly 30 years, so says dictionary.com, that some rural places transformed from an area with a few native communities and a couple trappers into urban areas. Also, most of the Pacific Northwest population could be found in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, and Spokane. In fact, by 1910, 1/3 of the Pacific Northwest population was in those 4 cities. This picture about sums up what urbanization was like probably in Washington State. The guy at the black hat goes, "Frog Gulch sure has changed since the last time I was here." And as they look around, they can see a bank, some store here, a hotel there. Let's talk about our first city, Tacoma, Washington. Now, the Northern Pacific Railroad was looking for a Puget Sound city to end at. Remember, this was the second transcontinental railroad to go through our country, and it went right into the Pacific Northwest into Washington. Whatever city they would choose would experience tremendous growth. I want you to pause the video for a second. I want you to think for a moment and ask yourself, why would a city that had the end of the transcontinental railroad experience such growth? Hopefully you thought for a second. The reason? Well, first off, if that city was a port city, they could easily ship natural resources all over the world. Also, people who like to start new businesses tended to start those new businesses close to the railroad station because, well, that station is where people got off the railroad, so they could easily see these new businesses, thus creating more money. Well, the Northern Pacific, headed by Mr. Henry Villard, chose Tacoma, which was only a village, actually, over Seattle. Now, Seattle, they put in a huge offer to have this railroad. In fact, they said the Northern Pacific could have 7,500 town lots to build a railroad. They said they could have 3,000 acres. And they also promised him $50,000 in cash. And still the Northern Pacific said, we don't want you. Doing some research, I found out that the Northern Pacific actually started buying up land around Tacoma, which is at Commencement Bay. They actually built their own little city outside of Tacoma called New Tacoma. Eventually, New Tacoma and Tacoma came together. So let's talk about now some effects of this railroad coming in to Tacoma. Well, Tacoma's population in 1880 was roughly 1,100. In 1890, that jumped to 45,000 people. Now, the railroad was completed in 1887, so kind of right near the end of that 10 years I was talking about. That's a huge amount of growth. Also, the railroad, completed in 1887 again, was done 2 years before Washington joined the country in 1889. In 1890, Tacoma had 225 mechanical and manufacturing jobs in the city. These jobs employed 4,000 people. No wonder Tacoma was considered one of the major cities of our state, and all because of the railroad. Unfortunately, in 1890, there was an economic slump in the country, and it hurt Tacoma bad. Between 1890 and 1910, the population only rose about 5,700 people. That's not that much. Especially considering that from 1880 to 1890, the population rose almost 35,000. Part of the reason for this economic slump is the fact that the city had invested largely in the railroad. And the industries that were tied to the railroad slumped big time as well. They were so focused really on one thing that it really hurt this city. Now, upon doing more research, I found out that the rich people eventually were okay in Tacoma. However, they were the only ones. The people in Tacoma continued to have a hard time, and in fact, there was no new rich people added to the city of Tacoma. Because usually that's what happens. An economy continues to grow and is healthy, meaning that more people are becoming rich. You don't just have the same families. By the way, I forgot to mention, this picture is of the village of Tacoma. This is of Tacoma after the railroad, so you can see the growth of that city. Now let's talk about Seattle. Seattle, as I mentioned, wanted the North Pacific terminus, meaning like the end of the railroad. However, as we found out, they got rejected. But they did not get down on their luck. A group of wealthy investors from the city built tracks to a mining town called Newcastle. As we can see from this picture, I believe these are some of those tracks to Newcastle. In 1906, the people of Seattle were able to convince J.J. Hill to build a nice train station, because before they weren't using much of anything that was nice to look at. Now, another huge bonus with having J.J. Hill bring the Great Northern Railroad into Seattle was the fact that Hill truly wanted to expand his empire and to be an empire builder. He wanted to trade with Japan, and that dream became a reality. And lo and behold, Seattle was the port city that Hill used to have goods trade to Japan and then come back. And this is where we see definitely Seattle becoming an international city. I want you to think about this for a moment. Why would Hill use Seattle as his port city? Why not any other city up and down the coast of the western part of our country? I think I may have given the answer earlier. As I mentioned, in 1906, J.J. Hill created what was then called the Union Depot. Now it's called, I better double check, I'm afraid I'm going to forget, the King Street Station. Now, this is actually referred to as Hill's Folly, because people thought he was just crazy to do this. What he wanted is he wanted to have a tunnel go under the city to the station. It was going to be a double-track tunnel. As I had a picture on the other slide, you would have seen that was Union Depot, which actually still stands, and some of you guys watching this video may have been there. Now let's talk about the actual city and how the railroad affected it. Seattle's population in 1880 was 3,553 people. In 1890, that was multiplied by a lot, and you can maybe do the math. The population in 1890 was 42,837 people. This then doubled in 1900. And then in 1910, that number actually tripled. In 1910, the population of Seattle was 237,174 people. Compare that to Tacoma, whose was a lot lower. Now, some benefits of being a huge city. First off, you had electric power. They had a sewer system. They also had a water system that was created for a large city. Now, I miss the Klondike. The Klondike was something, as well as with the railroad, that helped to spur Seattle. Now, from the research I did, one historian claimed that the Klondike, yes, helped, but after a while, gold goes away, and then so do the people spending the money. However, Seattle already had such a good economic foundation because of the railroad and all their businesses that the Klondike Gold Rush helped kickstart the economy more, and then the good foundation that was already in Seattle's economy just kept the good times rolling. Now, part of those good times rolling was the fact that lots of new jobs were being invested in, drawing people in for work in these new jobs. Now, lastly, let's talk about Spokane, Washington, which is over in eastern Washington. In 1881, there was only 1,000 people. However, by 1900, 40,000 people lived in Spokane. Some of the reasons why so many people were drawn there: first, it was built next to a waterfall. Waterfalls are a part of the Spokane River, which allowed them to have water power as an advantage. For example, water power could power sawmills, flour mills, and electricity. If you take a look at this picture, you see some of the falls in Spokane. I've never been there. I've never seen the falls. This picture said these are the upper falls, I believe. Those of you who have been to Spokane, tell me in class, next class, about these falls, because I would love to learn more about them. Another reason Spokane became such a big city is the fact that both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Railroads both entered the city. As a result, branch railroads started coming in from lumber, farming, and mining areas, bringing in more wealth and more trade opportunities. Also, Spokane benefited from silver mines that were found in Idaho and British Columbia. Reading more, I found out that there was gold mines, zinc, copper, a lot of natural resources were found around Spokane, and because of the railroad, people had an easy chance to come into the city to bring their money and to live. Because who wants to live in the middle of nowhere in Idaho or British Columbia when you can live in Spokane? In 1889, a fire destroyed the city, and a lot of people thought that, oh, this fire destroyed everything, the city's done for. However, upon further research, I learned that the fire destroyed a lot of old rickety buildings that probably should have been destroyed anyways. So the city was rebuilt with brick, and like a phoenix being born from a fire, Spokane thrived. In 1909, I read that 26 millionaires called Spokane City home. Thank you for watching this flip video. Please go to Edmodo to work on the 2 questions that are there.